The Platte River ran swift and muddy that afternoon in late August 1880, swollen from 3 days of upstream rain that had turned the prairie into a patchwork of standing water and treacherous mud. The current churned brown and thick, carrying branches and debris from homesteads 20 miles north, and the air smelled of wet earth and the metallic tang of approaching thunder. Sunlight broke through the cottonwoods in jagged beams, turning the water's surface into hammered copper, and through that blinding glare came the sound Elon had learned to fear most in his 28 years, the rapid thunder of hooves, the sharp crack of rifles being cocked, the shouts of men who had already decided that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. He stood waist-deep in the current, his legs braced against the pull of water that wanted to sweep him downstream, and in his arms he held a bundle so small and still that his chest tightened with a fear he had not felt since the winter his son died. The infant's face was gray lips, tinged blue, and Elon could not tell if the child was breathing. His hands, scarred from years of tracking, fighting, surviving, shook as he lifted the bundle higher, trying to keep the baby's mouth clear of the spray that rose every time the current struck a submerged log. Let him live. Just let him live. The thought was a prayer, though Elon had stopped believing in prayers 5 years ago when soldiers burned his village and his brother and son froze in the snow because there was no shelter, no warmth, no God who cared enough to intervene. But now, with this fragile life in his hands and 6 riders bearing down on them with rifles raised, he found himself praying anyway. Beside him, Ayanna pressed her hand against his elbow, steadying him as the current tried to pull them both under. She was 25, slender, but strong, her hair in 2 braids, wrapped with strips of rabbit fur that had come loose in the water. Her cotton dress clung to her body, the beaded yoke heavy with river water, and her dark eyes were fixed on the baby's face with an intensity that made Elon's throat tighten. She leaned close, her fingers brushing the infant's cheek, checking for warmth, for breath, for any sign of life. "He's breathing," she said, and the relief in her voice was so profound it made Elon's knees weak. "Faint, but he's breathing." 10 yards downstream, caught against a drift log bleached white by sun, and flood the body of a young woman rolled gently in the current. Her traveling dress, brown calico with mother-of-pearl buttons, hung torn and sodden, the fabric ballooning in the water. Her hair spread around her head like dark kelp, and her eyes, still open, had gone cloudy with silt. She had been 22 years old. Her name had been Cassandra Doyle, and less than an hour ago she had burst from the willows in a wagon with a broken axle, screaming that men were chasing her, that they would kill her and her baby, that someone had to help. Elon had waded in without thinking, driven by instinct, honed from years as an army scout. And he had pulled the infant free just as the wagon overturned and Cassandra went under. They had tried to save her. Ayanna had grabbed her arm. Elon had dragged her toward the bank, but the current was too strong and the drift log too close. Cassandra's head struck the wood with a sickening crack, and after that she did not struggle. Now her body floated lifeless, while her child clung to survival in Elon's arms. From the bank a voice cut through the air with the cold precision of a man who had spent 55 years learning how to command not just a room, but a killing ground. No survivors. Not the Indians, not the babe. Nothing leaves here alive. Sheriff Jeremiah Pike sat his bay gelding with the ease of a man born to authority. His boots were polished despite the dust of the trail, his gray mustache trimmed with meticulous care, and the county star badge pinned to his vest caught the sunlight like a warning. He held a Winchester 1873 rifle across his saddle, the barrel aimed at the river, and his face was set in an expression that could have been mistaken for righteousness, if not for the fear that flickered in his pale gray eyes, a fear that Elon recognized because he had seen it before in men who knew they were about to lose everything. Behind Pike, 5 men fanned out along the bank. Ranch hands, a bounty hunter with a scar across his jaw, a deputy who kept his face turned away. Their horses stamped and blew their own rifles raised, and they moved with the coordination of men who had done this kind of work before. Ilan felt the baby stir against his chest, a small movement that sent a jolt of hope through him. The child's mouth opened, a weak cry escaping, and Ilan shifted his grip to shield the infant's face from the spray. Water lapped at his waist, cold despite the summer heat, and he could feel the current tugging at his moccasins, trying to pull him off balance. Ayanna stepped between Ilan and the rifles, her chin lifted, her hands empty, but her stance defiant. Water streamed from her dress, darkening the hem, and her eyes met Ilan's for a fraction of a second. In that glance, past a conversation, they did not need to speak aloud. They had no chance if they stayed. The rifles would cut them down before they reached the bank. And even if they survived the bullets, Pike would hunt them across the prairie until there was no place left to hide. But the river ran fast here, and the willows grew thick 20 yards downstream where the current bent around a sandbar. If they could reach that cover, if they could keep the baby's face above water, if they could move before Pike gave the order to fire. Ayanna nodded once, barely a tilt of her head. And Ilan felt something shift inside him. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust, of the kind forged not in words, but in shared desperation. In the understanding that survival depended on moving as one. He took a breath, wrapped his body around the infant, and dove sideways into the current. The water closed over them, cold and brown and roaring, and Ilan felt the baby stiffen in his arms. He kicked hard, angling downstream, his free arm reaching for Ayanna. Her hand found his fingers locking around his wrist, and they moved together through the murky water, using the current to carry them toward the willows. Bullets cracked overhead, churning the surface, and Ilan felt one pass so close to his shoulder it left a line of heat across his skin. He surfaced just long enough to gasp. Air checked the baby's face, still breathing, thank everything, still breathing, and dove again. They reached the reeds, in a tangle of limbs, and gasping breaths, the baby wailing now, with the thin, reedy cry of a newborn in distress. Ayanna pressed her hand over the child's mouth to muffle the sound, her palm gentle but firm, and Ilan used his knife to cut away the soaked blanket and replace it with his beaded vest, tying the child against his chest with a strip of cloth torn from Ayanna's skirt. The baby's skin was cold, too cold, and Ayanna placed her hands on either side of the infant's body, sharing her warmth, her fingers brushing Ilan's ribs in the process. Their foreheads touched briefly as they crouched in the water with bullets still cracking through the branches overhead. Her breath came fast and uneven, his steady despite the fear coiling in his gut, and in that instant, with mud on their faces and death a few yards away, he felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. "I've got you," he said, and the words surprised him because he had not planned to say them, had not planned to make any promises to anyone ever again. Ayanna's eyes searched his face, and then she nodded, trusting him with a speed that shook him. "Then move." They crawled through the marsh on their bellies, staying low, the baby pressed between them. Behind them, Pike's men searched the riverbank with methodical thoroughness, their voices carrying across the water. Elin counted footsteps, measured distances, calculated how long they had before the search widened. The storm clouds gathering in the west brought early darkness, and by the time the first drops of rain began to fall, they had disappeared into the rows of corn that belonged to Samuel Rojas, a farmer Ilan knew by reputation but had never met. They moved through the corn in silence, the tall stalks whispering around them, the baby's cries muffled against Ilan's chest. Ayanna tore another strip from her skirt to bind the infant more tightly, wrapping the fabric around Ilan's torso so his hands were free. Her fingers lingered on his skin longer than necessary, and he felt the warmth of her touch even through the cold and exhaustion. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. Ilan looked down at the baby, at the small face scrunched in distress, and realized he did not know. "We'll have to ask someone who knew her. If we survive." "We'll survive," he said, and hoped it was true. The ford lay 2 miles downstream from Buffalo Gap, a cattle town that had grown fat on trail drives and freight wagons hauling supplies west to the mining camps. The town boasted 3 saloons, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, a telegraph office, and a single physician who worked out of a clapboard building that doubled as the undertaker's parlor. The streets were mud in spring and dust in summer, and the people who lived there had learned to keep their opinions to themselves unless those opinions aligned with the preferences of Sheriff Jeremiah Pike. Elan had come to Buffalo Gap in February, following a winter so brutal it had killed his horse and left him walking the last 30 miles with frostbite blackening 2 of his toes. He had been an Army scout once pressed into service after being captured during the Apache Wars, and given the choice between prison or guiding soldiers through terrain they could not read. After 3 years of that work, they had released him with a letter of commendation that was worth less than the paper it was printed on. And he had drifted north into the prairie states, where the land was flat and endless, and the people did not know his face or his history. He carried scars on his left shoulder from a rustler's bullet, and deeper scars from the winter 5 years ago when his brother and his 7-year-old son had frozen to death in a makeshift camp after soldiers burned their village. He did not speak of those losses, but they lived in the set of his jaw, and the way he kept his back to walls, and the nightmares that woke him before dawn, with his heart pounding and his hands reaching for weapons that were not always there. Ayanna had been in Buffalo Gap longer, nearly 2 years. Her father had been a tinsmith skilled enough to trade with settlers and Indians alike. And when he died of pneumonia the previous autumn, she had continued his work repairing kettles and pots and selling beadwork to women who wanted something exotic to display in their parlors. She had left her village near Willow Gap after the grazing lands were fenced off by homesteaders who filed claims with the land office and brought surveyors with theodolites and chains. She had watched her people scatter, some to reservations, some to Mexico, some into the hills where they would starve slowly rather than submit to ration lines. She stayed because her father had wanted to believe that skill and trade could build a bridge between worlds, and she honored that belief even after it buried him. They had met in April, bartering over cornmeal at the table of Dr. Franklin Moore, a man of 45 with thinning hair and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. Moore was the kind of physician who worked for promises and vegetables as often as coin, and he kept a careful ledger of debts that he rarely called in. He had been setting a boy's broken arm when Cassandra Doyle's wagon came crashing through the willows at the ford. The axle snapped, the horse screaming as it tried to keep its footing. Cassandra had been in the back of the wagon clutching her infant and shouting words that were half drowned by the roar of the river. Ellen had been the first to reach her, wading in before he could think better of it, and he had pulled the baby free just as the current dragged Cassandra under. Ayanna had followed without hesitation, her skirts soaking instantly, and together they had tried to haul the young woman to the bank. But the river was too strong and the drift log too close. Dr. Moore had arrived within minutes, his medical bag clutched in one hand, and he had worked over Cassandra's body with the methodical desperation of a man who had lost too many patients to accept another without a fight. He pressed on her chest, forced air into her lungs, checked her pulse at throat and wrist, and finally sat back on his heels with water dripping from his sleeves and his face gray with defeat. "She's gone," he said. The baby, wrapped now in Ayanna's shawl, had begun to cry, a thin, reedy sound that carried upstream where Sheriff Pike and his men were already riding hard toward the noise. Buffalo Gap was Pike's town in every way that mattered. He had been sheriff for 12 years, elected by margins that grew wider each term. Not because he was loved, but because he was feared, and he controlled the flow of money and influence with the precision of a bookkeeper balancing ledgers. He owned shares in the ferry that crossed the Platte 5 miles upstream, an operation run by a man named Marcus Wilkes, who charged exorbitant fees and kept records that were not open to public inspection. Pike also held mortgages on half the businesses on Main Street, including the telegraph office. And he had a reputation for fairness that was built on the graves of men who had challenged him and lost. His son, Reginald Pike, was 30 years old, handsome in a way that women found charming, until they knew him better. He managed his father's ranch 10 miles south of town, a spread that ran 2,000 head of cattle, and employed a dozen men who asked no questions and accepted no excuses. The people of Buffalo Gap knew these things, and they also knew that Sheriff Pike did not tolerate loose ends. When Celia Harrow, the 40-year-old schoolteacher, had tried to organize a parents' meeting to discuss the lack of funds for textbooks, Pike had reminded her that the school building sat on land he leased to the county, and leases could be renegotiated. When Samuel Rojas, a farmer with 40 acres of corn and a wife and 4 children, had complained about cattle trampling his crops, Pike had suggested that fences were expensive and that accidents happened to people who made too much noise. So when Pike and his men arrived at the ford and saw Elin and Ayanna standing in the river with a dead white woman and a living baby, they understood immediately that this was a situation that required control. Pike's order, "No survivors, not the Indians, not the babe, nothing leaves here alive," was delivered in the same tone he might use to order coffee. It was not rage. It was policy. The rain came in sheets by the time they reached the edge of Samuel Rojas's property, turning the dust to mud and the irrigation ditches into streams that overflowed their banks. Elon moved through the corn, with the infant clutched to his chest, the child's face pressed against his skin for warmth. Ayanna followed close behind her, hand on his shoulder for guidance in the darkness, and neither of them spoke because sound carried too far in the stillness after rain. By the time they reached the farmhouse, full night had fallen, and the only light came from occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the yard in stark white bursts. Elon crouched at the edge of the field scanning for movement, while Ayanna checked the baby's breathing. The infant had stopped crying, which was either a good sign or a terrible one. "He needs warmth," she said. "And milk." Elon nodded. He had known Samuel Rojas by reputation, a man who kept to himself, who paid his debts and did not start fights, but he did not know if Rojas would risk his family to shelter fugitives. Still, there were no other options. The nearest town was 15 miles east, and Pike's men would be watching the roads. He crossed the yard in a crouch, keeping to the shadows, and rapped twice on the back door with his knuckles. Inside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and Samuel Rojas peered out with a shotgun in his hands. Rojas was 45, stocky and weathered, with a scar on his chin from a farming accident and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Elin, then at Ayanna, then at the bundle strapped to Elon's chest, and his expression shifted from suspicion to grim understanding. "Inside," he said. "Quick." The farmhouse was small but warm, and Rojas's wife Maria took the baby from Elon's arms with practiced efficiency. She was a round woman with gray streaks in her hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had raised 4 children of her own. She unwrapped the infant, examined him for injuries, and wrapped him in a clean blanket before placing him near the stove. "He'll live," she said. "But he needs milk. I have goat's milk, it will do for now." While Maria worked, Rojas stood by the window, and the shotgun cradled in his arms, watching the yard. His eldest son, a boy of 16, stood beside him with a pitchfork, and the 2 younger children, girls of 12 and 10, huddled near their mother, wide-eyed and silent. "Pike's men came through an hour ago," Rojas said without turning. "Looking for 2 Indians and a baby. Said there'd be a reward. $50 for information, 100 if they're delivered alive." Elon felt Ayanna tense beside him. She was wringing water from her skirt, her hands moving mechanically, and he could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders sagged. "We didn't kill her," Elon said. "The woman in the river. She was running from something and she drowned trying to escape." "I know," Rojas said. He turned then, his gaze moving from Elon to Ayanna and back again. Dr. Moore came by this evening. Said to expect you. He told me what he saw at the ford, said the woman had bruises on her arms, old ones, and that she'd been to see him a month ago, asking about safe places to hide. Ayanna stopped wringing her skirt. She was running from Pike. From his son, more likely, Rojas said. Reginald Pike has a taste for women who can't say no, and his father cleans up the messes. If that baby is Reginald's, and if the mother was talking to people before she died, then Pike needs to make sure nobody asks questions. Ilan absorbed this information in silence. He had known men like Pike before, men who used the law as a tool to enforce their will, who wrapped cruelty in the language of order and called it justice. He had also known men like Rojas, who did what was right even when it was dangerous. And he felt a flicker of gratitude that made his throat tighten. "We need to get word to someone outside Pike's reach," Ilan said. "The railroad superintendent, the territorial marshal, someone who can investigate." "The telegraph office is owned by Pike's banker," Rojas said. "Any message you send during the day will go straight to him. But there's a way. Celia Harrow, the schoolteacher, she has a key to the office. Uses it to send supply orders after hours. If you can get to her, she can send a message when the operator's not there." Ilan looked at Ayanna, saw the determination in her eyes, despite the exhaustion, and made his decision. "We'll go tonight." Rojas shook his head. "Pike's men are still out there. You won't make it on foot, not with the baby." He paused and then sighed. "Take my horse, the roan mare. She's steady and she knows the trails, but you bring her back, you hear?" "We will," Ilan said. Maria brought the baby to Ayanna, the child now wrapped in a clean blanket and sucking weakly on a rag soaked in goat's milk. "You take care of him," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "He deserves better than what his blood gave him." As they prepared to leave, Rojas pulled Ilan aside. "There's something else you should know. Pike's daughter Delphine, she left town 5 years ago. Ran off in the middle of the night, and Pike told everyone she'd gone to live with relatives back east. But I heard rumors she tried to expose what her father and brother were doing, and Pike threatened to have her committed to an asylum. She wrote letters to some of the townspeople warning them, but Pike intercepted most of them. If you find her, she might be willing to testify." Ellen filed this information away. "Where would we find her?" "No idea," Rojas said. "But keep your ears open. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up." They left an hour later, riding double on the roan mare with the baby strapped to Ilan's chest once more. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick with mud, and the horse picked its way carefully along the irrigation ditches that ran parallel to the main road. Ayanna sat behind Ilan, her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the warmth of his body through the damp fabric of his shirt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not running. For staying to fight." Ilan was silent for a moment, and then he said, "I've been running for 5 years. I'm tired of it." Her grip tightened around his waist, and he covered her hands with one of his own, steadying her as the horse navigated a steep slope. The touch lasted only a moment, but it was enough to send warmth through both of them, a promise of something neither was ready to name. They reached Lead Hill, where Celia Harrow's schoolhouse stood on a rise overlooking the town just before midnight. The building was dark, but Ilan could see a faint glow in the window of the small cabin attached to the back Celia's living quarters. He dismounted, helped Ayanna down, and knocked softly on the door. Celia opened it immediately, as if she had been expecting them. She was 40 years old, thin and severe, with gray eyes and a no-nonsense manner that commanded respect from children and adults alike. She took one look at the baby and stepped aside without a word. Inside the cabin, Celia bolted the door and pulled the curtains closed before lighting a second lamp. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a desk covered in papers, and a stove that still radiated heat from the evening's fire. "Dr. Moore sent word," Celia said. "He told me what happened at the ford. He also told me what he found when he examined the body." Ayanna was warming the baby by the stove, rocking him gently, and she looked up sharply. "What did he find?" "Bruises," Celia said. "On her arms, her thighs, her back. Old ones mostly healed, but fresh ones too. And she'd been to see him a month ago, asking if there were places a woman could go if she needed to leave her husband. Moore said she was terrified, but she wouldn't give him a name. She just kept saying, 'He'll kill me if he finds out I told.'" Ellen frowned. She had a husband. "Not exactly," Celia said. She crossed to her desk back and pulled out a folded piece of paper which she handed to Ilan. "This came in the mail 2 weeks ago. It's a copy of a marriage certificate filed with the county clerk. Cassandra Doyle married to Reginald Pike, dated 3 months ago." Ellen unfolded the paper and studied it by lamplight. The certificate looked official with the clerk's seal and signature, but something about it felt wrong. The handwriting was too neat, the paper too new, and the date did not match the timeline of Cassandra's pregnancy. "She was a mail-order bride?" Ayanna asked. "Worse," Celia said. "She was trafficked. There's a ferry crossing 5 miles upriver, run by a man named Marcus Wilkes. He brings women in from back east, tells them they're coming to marry settlers or ranchers, and then he sells them to the highest bidder. Most of them don't have family, or they're running from something, so nobody asks questions when they disappear." Ilan felt his jaw tighten. He had heard stories like this before, women promised new lives and given only new chains. It was a trade that thrived in places where the law was weak or corrupt, and it required men like Pike to make it work. "Pike is protecting Wilkes," he said. "More than that," Celia replied. "Pike is invested. He takes a cut of the fees, and in exchange he makes sure nobody investigates. If a woman tries to run Pike's men, bring her back. If she talks too much, she ends up in the river." Ayanna's arms tightened around the baby. "And this child—" Celia's expression softened. "Moore thinks the baby is Reginald's. Cassandra was pregnant when she arrived, and Moore treated her for a fever a month ago. She told him Reginald forced her, and she was trying to find a way to leave before the baby was born. But Pike found out, and he arranged for her to be moved south, away from the territory. She must have jumped from the ferry before they could take her." Ilan crossed to the stove and looked down at the infant, who was now sleeping fitfully against Ayanna's chest. The child's face was round and soft, unmarked by the violence of his short life. And Ilan felt a surge of anger so fierce it made his hands shake. "We need proof," he said. "Something that ties Pike to the ferry, to Wilkes, to the trafficking. Without it, we're just fugitives, and Pike will hunt us down." Celia nodded. "I thought the same thing. That's why I went through Cassandra's belongings after Moore brought them to me." She produced a leather satchel from beneath her bed and set it on the desk. Inside were a few articles of clothing, a hairbrush, and a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Ellen unwrapped the bundle carefully and found a Rail Express envelope, a telegraph receipt, a carte de visite photograph, and a silver locket. The telegraph receipt was dated 2 weeks earlier, sent from Buffalo Gap to a M. Wilkes lot, number 14. The message read, "Delivery delayed. Adjust schedule." It was signed J. Pike. The photograph showed Cassandra standing beside a young man who could only be Reginald Pike. She was visibly pregnant, her hand resting on her belly, and the expression on her face was one of hollow resignation. Reginald, by contrast, looked pleased, almost smug. The locket was engraved on the back, "To CD, for a new life, J." Ilan set the items on the desk and met Celia's eyes. "This is evidence," It's a start, Celia said. But you need more. You need Wilkes's records or testimony from someone who knows what he and Pike are doing. And you need to get it to someone outside Pike's control, the railroad superintendent, the territorial marshal, someone who can bring in federal investigators. Ayanna shifted the baby to one arm and reached for the photograph with her free hand. She studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then she looked at Elan. We can't run. If we run, Pike will find us eventually, and he'll kill us and the baby both. The only way we survive is if we expose him. Elan knew she was right, but the thought of going up against Pike, of deliberately walking into the crosshairs of a man with a badge and a private army, felt like signing their death warrants. Still, he had learned long ago that survival was not about avoiding danger. It was about choosing which risks to take. We'll need help, he said. Celia nodded. Dr. Moore is with you. So is Samuel Rojas. He owes Moore a debt, and he's not afraid of Pike. There are others too, people who've been hurt by Pike's greed or his son's cruelty. But you'll need to move carefully. Pike has eyes everywhere. As if to punctuate her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, growing louder. Celia moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains, her face tightening. Riders, she said. 3 of them, coming this way. Elan extinguished the lamp and drew his knife, positioning himself beside the door. Ayanna wrapped the baby more tightly in the blanket and moved to the corner of the room, ready to shield the child with her body. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped outside the schoolhouse. A fist pounded on the door. Open up, sheriff's business. Celia glanced at Elan, who shook his head. She straightened her shoulders, crossed to the door, and opened it a crack, keeping the chain latch in place. It's after midnight, she said coldly. What do you want? The man on the other side was one of Pike's deputies, a heavy-set brute named Garrett, who was known for his enthusiasm with a club. We're looking for 2 Indians and a baby. You seen them? No, Celia said. And I don't appreciate being woken up to answer fool questions. If I see anyone, I'll report it in the morning. Garrett leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. Pike says you're to keep an eye out. There's a reward. $50 for information more if you help us bring them in. I'm aware, Celia said. Now get off my property before I file a complaint with the county board. Garrett hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a manner. But Celia's reputation as a woman who did not back down was well established. He muttered something under his breath and turned away. And a moment later, the hoofbeats resumed fading into the distance. Celia closed the door and leaned against it, her hands trembling slightly. That was too close. Elan resheathed his knife. We need to leave, now. Not yet, Celia said. She crossed to the desk and began writing on a piece of paper, her hand moving quickly. I'm going to send a telegraph to the railroad superintendent first thing in the morning. I'll tell him there's been a murder and a cover-up, and I'll give him enough details to start an investigation. But you need to get to Wilkes's office before Pike realizes what we're doing. If you can get his records, his ledger, his correspondence, then we'll have enough to bury him. Ayanna stepped forward, the baby still in her arms. Where is Wilkes's office? Above the general store, Celia said. He keeps it locked, but there's a window in the back that doesn't latch properly. If you go now while Pike's men are out searching the roads, you might be able to get in and out before anyone notices. Elan looked at Ayanna, saw the exhaustion in her face and the determination in her eyes, and nodded. We'll go. Celia handed him the telegraph receipt and the locket. Take these. If something happens to me, you'll need them. As they prepared to leave, Elon fumbled with the straps that held the baby to his chest, his hands still stiff from the cold water. Ayanna stepped close, her fingers brushing his as she adjusted the fabric, and for a moment their faces were only inches apart. Her breath was warm on his cheek, and he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as she concentrated on the knot. "You're shaking," she said softly. "Cold." He lied. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, her fingers lingering on his chest, and then she stepped back. But the moment stayed with him, a warmth that spread through his body despite the chill of the night. They left through the back door, moving quickly through the shadows, and the darkness swallowed them whole. The town of Buffalo Gap was silent at 2 a.m, and the streets empty except for a stray dog that slunk between buildings and a drunk who lay snoring on the boardwalk outside one of the saloons. Elon and Ayanna moved through the alleys behind Main Street, keeping to the darkest corners, the baby strapped to Elon's chest and sleeping fitfully. The general store stood at the center of town, a 2-story building with a false front and windows that reflected the moonlight like blind eyes. The back of the building was accessible through a narrow alley choked with barrels and crates. Elon tested the back door first, found it locked, and then examined the window on the second floor. It was 8 feet off the ground, set above a rain barrel, and the latch was visible through the glass, a simple hook that had not been fully closed. He turned to Ayanna. "I'll go up. You stay here and keep watch." She shook her head. "You're carrying the baby. I'm lighter and I can move quieter. You stay." He wanted to argue, but she was already climbing onto the rain barrel, her skirt hiked up and her bare feet finding purchase on the rough wood. She reached the window, slid her knife blade through the gap, and lifted the latch with a soft click. A moment later she was inside, and Elon heard the faint creak of floorboards as she moved through the room above. He waited, every sense alert, the baby's breathing a soft rhythm against his chest. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, and he found himself counting heartbeats to keep calm. He thought of Ayanna moving through the darkness above him, thought of her fingers on his chest in Celia's cabin, thought of the way she had looked at him with something he did not yet have a name for. The window opened again, and Ayanna's face appeared pale in the moonlight. She tossed down a leather-bound ledger, a bundle of papers tied with string, and a small metal lockbox. Elon caught them one by one and set them carefully on the ground. Ayanna climbed back out, lowered herself until she was hanging by her hands, and dropped the last few feet. She landed in a crouch, breathing hard, and Elon helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her arm a moment longer than necessary. "What did you find?" "Everything." She said, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "Names, dates, payments. Wilkes has been bringing women through the ferry for 2 years. Pike's signature is on half the receipts." Before Elon could respond, a voice called out from the street, "Hold it right there." Elon froze. He recognized the voice, quiet Quentin Pike's youngest deputy, a man of 35, who rarely spoke and never smiled. Quentin stepped into the mouth of the alley, his shotgun cradled in his arms, and his eyes moved from Elon to Ayanna, to the bundle of papers in her hands. For a long moment, no one moved. The baby stirred against Elon's chest, making a small sound, and Quentin's gaze dropped to the infant. Something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, but not cruelty either. He looked at the ledger, then at Elon, and his jaw tightened. "Get out of here," Quentin said softly. "Now. I didn't see you." Elon did not wait for him to change his mind. He grabbed Ayanna's hand and pulled her past Quentin, moving fast but not running. Behind them they heard Quentin shout. They went east toward the river, and the sound of his boots pounding in the opposite direction buying them time. They reached the irrigation ditches on the outskirts of town and followed them north, skirting the fields of corn and wheat. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray line on the horizon, and Elan knew they had only a few hours before Pike's men regrouped. By the time they reached Tin Cup Creek, 3 miles north of Buffalo Gap, the sun was rising, and they were both exhausted. The creek ran shallow here, no more than knee-deep, but it was wide and the banks were steep. Someone had laid a plank bridge across the narrowest point, and Elan approached it cautiously, testing the wood with his foot. The plank was slick with grease. He pulled his foot back just as a rifle shot cracked through the air, splintering the wood where he had been standing a moment before. On the far bank, 2 of Pike's men emerged from the trees, their rifles aimed. "No way across?" One of them called a man with a scar across his jaw and a voice like gravel. "Give us the baby and the papers, and we'll let you go." Elan did not believe him. He looked at Ayanna, saw the same calculation in her eyes, and made his decision. He untied the straps that held the baby to his chest, and handed the child to Ayanna, and then lowered himself onto the greased plank on his hands and knees. "Stay close behind me," he said. "Use me as a shield." Ayanna followed, crawling with the baby clutched to her chest. The plank bowed under their weight, slick and treacherous, and Elan felt his hands slipping. Bullets whined overhead, one so close it tore through the fabric of his shirt and left a burning line across his ribs. He kept moving inch by inch, his jaw clenched against the pain, until they reached the far side and rolled into the cover of the brush. The baby was screaming now, terrified and cold, and Ayanna pressed her hand over his mouth to muffle the sound. Elan reloaded his Springfield .73 trapdoor with shaking hands, his fingers slick with blood and grease, and Ayanna reached out to steady him, her touch warm and firm on his wrist. Their eyes met, and in that moment, with bullets tearing through the leaves above them and the baby crying between them, he felt something shift inside him. It was not love, not yet, but it was the seed of something that could grow into love if they survived long enough to let it. "We're going to make it," she said, and he believed her. They ran. Over the next 2 days, they moved through the prairie like ghosts, avoiding roads and towns, stealing water from irrigation ditches and food from root cellars when hunger became unbearable. They slept in shifts hidden in cornfields or beneath overturned wagons, and they took turns carrying the baby, who had begun to respond to the sound of their voices, with small gurgles and the occasional smile. Ayanna fashioned a sling from her skirt so the child could ride against her chest, and Elan showed her how to move silently through tall grass, how to read the land for cover and water, how to clear a jam in the Springfield .73 trapdoor's action when dirt clogged the mechanism. They worked in close quarters, his hands covering hers as he guided her fingers through the motions, and the contact sent warmth through both of them that had nothing to do with the summer heat. One afternoon, as they crossed a meadow at the edge of a creek, Ayanna stumbled on a gopher hole and nearly fell. Elan caught her by the waist, his arm wrapping around her to keep her upright. And for a moment they stood, frozen her back, pressed against his chest, his breath warm on her neck. The baby was between them, a small barrier that somehow made the moment more intimate rather than less. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not let go immediately. "You all right?" "Yes." But neither of them moved, and the silence stretched between them, filled with things they were not yet ready to say. Finally, Elan released her, his hand trailing across her hip as he stepped back, and they continued walking without another word. That night, they camped in a ravine, where a spring trickled from the rocks, and they shared the last of the cornbread Maria Rojas had packed for them. The baby slept between them, wrapped in a blanket that Celia had given them, and Ayanna sang softly a lullaby her mother had taught her, the words Apache and the melody haunting. "What does it mean?" Elan asked. "It's a song for children who are far from home," she said. "It tells them the stars are watching, and they are not alone." Elan looked up at the sky, at the stars scattered like seed across the darkness, and he thought of his son who had died so far from the place of his birth. that there had been no songs, no ceremony, only cold and silence. I had a son. He said the words coming out before he could stop them. He was 7. He died 5 years ago in the snow because I couldn't keep him warm. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, and then she reached across the baby and took his hand. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? His voice was bitter. I was his father. I was supposed to protect him. You did everything you could. Sometimes that's not enough, and it's not fair, but it's not your fault. He looked at her at the compassion in her eyes and felt the walls around his heart crack a little more. Why are you doing this? Risking your life for a child who isn't yours? Because he deserves to live, she said simply. And because I'm tired of watching people I care about disappear. My father died because he trusted the wrong people. My village scattered because no one stood up to the homesteaders. I'm done running. I'm done being afraid. Elan turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Then we'll stand together. She squeezed his hand, and they sat that way until the fire burned down to embers and the baby's breathing deepened into sleep. On the 3rd day, they reached the edge of the railroad line that ran west from Buffalo Gap to the mining camps. A water tower stood beside the tracks, and beside it was a small shed where section crews stored tools. Elan broke the lock with the pommel of his knife and found a hand-crank rail car inside the kind used by inspectors to travel between stations. We can use this, he said. Ayanna looked at the contraption, little more than a platform with a crank and 4 wheels, and shook her head. Pike's men will see us if we travel during the day. Then we travel at night, Elan said. The next station is 15 miles west at Grizzly Bend. There's a telegraph office there, and it's outside Pike's jurisdiction. If we can get there, we can send word to the territorial marshal. They waited until dark, and then loaded the rail car with the ledger, the papers, and the baby. Elan took the crank and began pumping his arms, burning with the effort, and the car rolled forward slowly at first, then faster as momentum built. Ayanna sat beside him, holding the baby and scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. The prairie stretched out on either side of the tracks, vast and empty, and the stars overhead were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. As they traveled, Ayanna sang softly to the baby, and Elan listened to her voice and felt something inside him unclench. He had spent so many years carrying grief, and anger had built walls around himself so high that he had forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. But here, on this rickety rail car, in the middle of nowhere with a woman he had known for only a handful of days, he felt those walls beginning to crumble. What will you do? Ayanna asked suddenly. After this is over? Elan kept cranking his breath, coming hard. I don't know. Find work, I suppose. Move on. You always move on. It's easier that way. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Maybe it doesn't have to be. He looked at her, and in the starlight, he could see the shape of her face, the curve of her cheek, the way her eyes reflected the light. He wanted to say something to tell her that he was tired of moving, that he wanted to stay, that he wanted to see what might grow between them if they had the chance. But before he could find the words, the baby began to fuss, and the moment passed. They reached Grizzly Bend just before dawn, exhausted and hungry. The station was a small building with a telegraph office and a waiting room, and it was deserted except for the operator, an old man, who looked at them with suspicion until Elan showed him the ledger and explained why they were there. The operator listened, his expression growing grim, and then he nodded. I'll send word to the territorial marshal. But you'd better be ready for trouble. Pike's not going to let this go without a fight. They rested in the waiting room while the telegraph operator sent his messages, the rhythmic clicking of the key, a counterpoint to the baby's soft breathing. Ayanna sat on a wooden bench with the child in her arms, her head tipped back against the wall, her eyes closed. Elan stood by the window watching the tracks for any sign of Pike's men, his hand resting on the grip of his knife. An hour passed, and then another. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build inside the small room. The telegraph operator brought them water and hardtack, and they ate in silence, too tired to speak. Just after noon, the door opened, and a man walked in. Elan's hand went to his knife, but the man raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said, his accent faintly Russian. "I'm not with Pike." The man was in his 40s, stocky and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and hands that spoke of years of hard labor. He wore canvas trousers and a wool vest, and there was a wary intelligence in his eyes. "My name is Igor Petrov," he said. "I'm a miner, or I was, until Pike took my claim using some legal maneuver I still don't understand. I've been following Wilkes for 2 weeks, looking for evidence to use against Pike in court. When I heard the telegraph operator sending messages about a ledger, I thought maybe we could help each other." Elan studied him, looking for signs of deception, and found none. "What kind of evidence do you have?" Petrov reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This. I took it from Wilkes's office 3 nights ago before he realized anyone was watching him." He unfolded the paper and spread it on the bench. It was a ledger page similar to the ones Ayanna had taken, but this one was different. It listed names, women's names, most of them first names only, alongside dates, amounts of money, and destinations. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, was a note. "If the child resembles Reginald, send her south on the night boat. J.P." Ayanna leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. "This is Cassandra's name," she said, pointing to an entry near the middle. "Lot number 14. Payment received from R. Pike, $500. Elan felt his blood run cold. $500 was more than most men earned in a year. It was not the price of a bride. It was the price of a commodity. "Cassandra was sold," he said slowly. "Wilkes brought her in on the ferry, and Pike's son bought her." "Not just her," Petrov said. "Look at the other names. Wilkes has been running this operation for years, bringing women from back east and selling them to ranchers and miners who don't want to wait for proper courtship. Pike protects him in exchange for a cut of the profits and first pick of the women for his son." Ayanna's hands tightened on the baby. "And when the women tried to leave, Pike made sure they didn't get far," Petrov said grimly. "There are at least 5 women listed here who disappeared after trying to run. No bodies, no investigations, just gone, like they never existed." Elan looked down at the baby in Ayanna's arms, and a terrible thought occurred to him. "Cassandra was pregnant when she arrived, wasn't she?" Petrov nodded. "According to the notes, yes. She was brought in 4 months ago, already showing. Wilkes charged Reginald double because of it." Ayanna's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then the baby isn't Reginald's?" "No," Petrov said. "But Pike didn't know that until after Cassandra was already here. When he found out, he panicked. A bastard child with the Pike name born to a woman who was bought and paid for it would destroy his reputation if word got out. So he decided to get rid of both of them." Elan felt the pieces falling into place, each one more damning than the last. The note at the bottom of the ledger page. "If the child resembles Reginald, send her south," was not about protecting the child. It was about eliminating evidence. "Pike wanted them dead," he said. "Both of them. That's why he ordered us killed at the ford. We were witnesses." "More than that," Petrov said. He pulled out another piece of paper, this one a photograph. It showed a group of men standing in front of the ferry landing, and in the center of the group was Sheriff Pike, his arm around the shoulders of Marcus Wilkes. The photograph was dated 6 months earlier, and written on the back in Pike's handwriting was a single word: partners. Ayanna took the photograph, her hands trembling. This proves Pike is involved. It proves more than that, Petrov said. Look at the baby again. Look at his eyes. Elan crouched beside Ayanna and studied the infant's face. The child's eyes were open, staring up at him with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, and they were gray, a clear pale gray that was almost silver. Pike's eyes, Petrov said. Same color, same shape. I saw him once up close when he was forcing me off my claim. The baby doesn't look like Reginald. He looks like Pike. The room went silent. Ayanna's face had gone pale, and Elan felt a surge of rage so intense it made his vision blur. Pike raped Cassandra. Ayanna said, her voice shaking. Not his son, Pike himself. And when she tried to run, he tried to kill her and the baby both to cover it up. Petrov nodded. That's my guess. And now that you've seen the ledger and the photograph, Pike will do anything to make sure you don't live long enough to testify. Before Elan could respond, the door opened again, and Dr. Moore stepped in, followed by a sturdy woman of 50 with gray hair and a no-nonsense manner. This is Dorothea Briggs, Moore said. She's a midwife. She delivered Cassandra's baby. Dorothea looked at the infant in Ayanna's arms, and her eyes filled with tears. I remember that night. Pike was there. He paid me $20 to keep my mouth shut, and I took it because I was afraid of what he'd do if I didn't. But I remember what Cassandra said to me while she was in labor. She said, he forced me. The sheriff forced me. And now I'm going to have his child, and he'll kill me for it. She begged me to help her leave, but I didn't. I was too scared. Dorothea's voice broke, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I should have helped her. Maybe she'd still be alive if I had. Elan felt a pang of sympathy for the woman, but he pushed it aside. Will you testify? Yes, Dorothea said. I'll tell everything I know. It's the least I can do for that poor girl. Moore stepped forward, his face grave. Pike arrested me and Celia 2 days ago for aiding fugitives. He released us this morning after Samuel Rojas and a group of farmers threatened to storm the jail. Pike knows he's losing control, and that makes him more dangerous than ever. He's also put out new bounties, $200 for you, Elan, $100 for Ayanna, $100 for the baby. Dead or alive. There are bounty hunters coming in from 3 counties. Elan looked at Ayanna, saw the determination in her face despite the fear, and made his decision. We don't have time to wait for the marshal. We go back to Buffalo Gap. We take the evidence, and we face Pike in front of the whole town. If we do it in the open with witnesses, he won't be able to kill us without exposing himself. And if he tries, Ayanna asked, then we make sure he doesn't succeed. Petrov nodded. There's a railroad bridge at Grizzly Bend. It crosses the gorge where the river runs through the canyon. If we can get Pike and Wilkes to meet us there, we can force a confrontation in a place where they can't use numbers against us. We'll have the high ground, and we'll have witnesses. How do we get them there? Elan asked. We send word that we're willing to trade, Petrov said. The ledger and the photograph for safe passage out of the territory. Pike won't believe it, but he'll come anyway because he knows we have the evidence to destroy him, and when he does, we'll have the town watching. He can't murder us in front of everyone without losing everything. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. They sent the message through Samuel Rojas, who rode to Pike's ranch under a white flag and delivered it in person. Pike's response came an hour later, carried by one of his men. He would meet them at the bridge at noon the following day, alone, except for Wilkes. No one believed he would come alone. That night, they camped in a ravine 5 miles from the bridge, and Elan stood watch while Ayanna tried to rest. The baby had been fussy all evening, crying and refusing to eat, and Ayanna had finally gotten him to settle by singing softly and rocking him against her chest. Elan watched her from across the fire, saw the exhaustion in her face and the tenderness in her hands, and he felt something twist inside him. He crossed to her side and sat down, careful not to wake the child. "You should rest. So should you. I'm not tired." She smiled faintly. "Liar." He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing hers. "If something happens tomorrow..." "It won't," she said firmly. "We're going to survive this, Elan. Both of us. All 3 of us." He wanted to believe her, but he had seen too much death to trust in happy endings. Still, he held her hand, and she did not pull away. And for a moment they sat in silence, connected by touch and the fragile hope that they might live to see another day. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that these past few days, they've meant something to me. You've meant something to me." Ayanna's eyes searched his face. "You don't have to say that." "I know, but I want to, in case I don't get another chance." She leaned forward and kissed him soft and tentative, her lips warm against his. It was a brief kiss, chaste by any measure, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had not yet said. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "You'll get another chance," she said. "I promise." He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Then I'll hold you to that." They sat together until the fire burned down to embers, and when Ayanna finally fell asleep with the baby in her arms, Elan watched over them both, his rifle across his knees, and he made a silent vow that he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The storm arrived just after dawn, rolling in from the west, with wind that bent the trees and rain that fell in sheets. By the time they reached the railroad bridge at Grizzly Bend, the river below was a churning mass of brown water, and the sky was the color of bruises. The bridge was a narrow iron structure that spanned the gorge 50 feet above the water, with wooden planks laid across the rails for foot traffic. It swayed in the wind, the metal groaning under the strain, and Elan could see that someone had rigged explosives to the support beam's barrels of black powder wrapped in oilcloth and connected by fuses that ran along the underside of the bridge. "Wilkes," Petrov said grimly, pointing to a figure on the far bank. "He's planning to blow the bridge once Pike gets what he wants." Elan scanned the area. Pike's men were positioned on both sides of the river, hidden in the rocks and trees, their rifles trained on the bridge. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more. Pike himself stood in the center of the bridge, his coat whipping in the wind, and beside him was Wilkes, a thin man with a sharp face and nervous hands that kept tugging at his collar. On the near bank, a crowd had gathered: farmers, townspeople, even a few of the cattle drovers who had been passing through. Among them were Samuel Rojas and his son Celia Harrow, Dr. Moore, Dorothea Briggs, and a woman Elan did not recognize, an older woman with a hard face and a black shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "That's Ethel Brennan," Petrov said. Her niece was one of the women Wilkes trafficked. She disappeared 2 years ago, and Ethel's been looking for answers ever since. The territorial marshal had not arrived. They were on their own. Elan turned to Ayanna. "Stay here with the baby. Keep him safe." "No," she said. "We do this together. We started this together, and we'll finish it together." He wanted to argue, but he saw the resolve in her eyes and knew it would be useless. He handed her his knife, and she tucked it into her belt. Then he took the baby and strapped him to his chest one last time, adjusting the sling so the child was secure, and they stepped onto the bridge. The wind howled, and the rain turned the planks slick. They walked slowly, carefully, their eyes on Pike. The sheriff watched them approach, his face unreadable, and when they were 10 feet away, he raised his hand. "That's far enough." Elan stopped. Around them, the crowd on the near bank had grown silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation unfolding on the bridge. He could feel their attention like a physical weight, and he knew that this moment, this single exchange, would determine not just their survival, but the fate of everyone Pike had hurt. "We have the ledger," Elan said, his voice carrying over the wind. "All the proof we need to hang you and Wilkes both. Names, dates, payments, testimony from witnesses. We know what you did to those women. We know what you did to Cassandra Doyle." Pike's expression did not change, but Elan saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear or maybe desperation. "You think anyone will believe you, an Indian and a dead woman's bastard. I'm the law here. I've been the law for 12 years, and I'm not about to let some drifter with a stolen ledger destroy everything I've built." "You're not the law," Ayanna said, stepping forward. "You're a criminal. You trafficked women. You raped Cassandra. And when she tried to escape with her baby, you tried to murder them both." Pike's face went white, and for a moment he looked like he might draw his gun. But then he seemed to remember the crowd watching, and he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That's a lie," he said. "My son married Cassandra in a legal ceremony. She was unstable, ran off with the baby, and drowned trying to cross the river. It was a tragedy, but it had nothing to do with me." "Then explain this," Elan said. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket and tossed it at Pike's feet. It landed on the wet planks with a soft clink. Pike stared at the locket, and the color drained from his face. "To CD. For a new life, Jay." Elan said, his voice hard. "Your initials, Sheriff. Your handwriting. Dorothea Briggs will testify that you were there when Cassandra gave birth. She'll testify that Cassandra said you forced her. And the baby?" He gestured to the infant strapped to his chest. "He has your eyes. Anyone with sense can see it." The crowd on the near bank erupted in murmurs, and Elan saw Ethel Brennan step forward, her voice ringing out. "My niece Sarah disappeared 2 years ago after she came through Wilkes's ferry. She wrote me a letter saying she was scared that she'd been sold to a rancher and couldn't leave. I want to know what happened to her." Other voices joined hers, men and women who had lost daughters, sisters, wives. The anger was palpable, a living thing that crackled in the air, and Pike's face twisted with rage. "You're all fools," he snarled. "You believe this Indian over me. I've kept this town safe for 12 years. I've brought order where there was chaos, and this is how you repay me. You brought corruption," Samuel Rojas called from the crowd. "You brought fear, and we're done living under your thumb." Pike's hand dropped to his gun, but before he could draw, another voice rang out, this one young and strained, coming from the far side of the bridge. "Father, stop." Everyone turned. A young man stood at the edge of the bridge, rain streaming down his face. Reginald Pike, the sheriff's son, looked haggard and pale, his hands shaking. Behind him stood a deputy. Elan did not recognize, his rifle lowered. "Reginald," Pike said, his voice sharp. "Get back to the ranch. This doesn't concern you." "It does," Reginald said. He stepped onto the bridge, his movements unsteady. "I know what you did, Father. I know you took Cassandra. I thought she was mine. You told me she was mine. But I saw the way you looked at her. I saw the bruises. And when she tried to run, you ordered me to help you stop her. I refused, and you called me weak." Pike's face contorted with fury. "You are weak," You've always been weak. I built this empire for you and you threw it away because you couldn't control one woman." "You didn't build an empire," Reginald said, his voice breaking. "You built a prison, and I won't be part of it anymore." He turned and walked off the bridge, disappearing into the crowd, and Pike stared after him with an expression of pure hatred. In that moment of distraction, Wilkes panicked. He lunged for the fuse attached to the explosives, his hands fumbling with a match. The flame sputtered in the rain, and he cursed, striking another. "No," Elon shouted, but Wilkes was already touching the match to the fuse. The fuse caught hissing and sparking as it burned toward the barrels of black powder. Elon grabbed Ayanna and pulled her toward the near bank, running as fast as he dared on the slick planks. The baby screamed, and Ayanna clutched at Elon's arm, her feet slipping. Pike recovered and lunged after them, drawing his knife, his face a mask of rage. "You're not leaving here alive," Pike shouted. Elon turned, positioning himself between Pike and Ayanna, his own knife in hand. The bridge shook, the metal groaning, and he could feel the heat of the burning fuse even through the rain. Pike slashed at him, the blade slicing across Elon's forearm, and blood streamed down his hand. He blocked the next strike, bashing Pike's wrist against the iron railing, and the sheriff's knife clattered to the planks. From above, quiet Quentin appeared at the edge of the bridge, his shotgun raised. "Sheriff, stand down." Pike ignored him, reaching for the knife, and Quentin fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the gorge, and Pike hesitated. "It's over," Quentin said. "You're done." Pike's face twisted, and he lunged again, this time at the baby. Elon threw himself in front of the child, taking a blow to the shoulder that sent him stumbling. Ayanna grabbed Pike's arm, digging her nails into his wrist, and Pike backhanded her across the face. She fell hard, and Elon's vision went red. He drove his shoulder into Pike's chest, shoving the sheriff back toward the railing. Pike grabbed at Elon's vest, trying to pull him down, and they grappled on the edge of the bridge, the rain making everything slick. Below them, the river churned brown and deadly. The fuse was halfway to the powder. "Elon!" Ayanna screamed. He looked up and saw Quentin throw something, a steel pin used to secure the bridge rails. The pin arced through the air and struck Pike on the side of the head with a sickening crack. Pike's eyes rolled back, his grip loosened, and he toppled backward over the railing, disappearing into the gorge below. Elon did not wait to see if Pike surfaced. He grabbed Ayanna's hand and pulled her to her feet, and they ran. The fuse was almost to the powder, sparking and hissing, and they had only seconds. Samuel Rojas and Igor Petrov waded into the shallows with a rope, and Elon dove from the bridge just as the explosion ripped through the air. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the ground and sent a plume of smoke and debris into the sky. The bridge buckled, the center section collapsing into the gorge, and Elon felt the heat wash over them as they hit the water. The cold was a shock, driving the air from his lungs, and he felt Ayanna's hand clawing at his arm. He wrapped his arms around her and the baby, using his body to shield them, and kicked toward the surface. They broke through, gasping, and Samuel and Igor hauled them to shore with a rope. The baby was coughing, water streaming from his nose and mouth, but he was alive. Ayanna collapsed on the muddy bank, clutching the sodden ledger to her chest, and Elon knelt beside her, his arm bleeding, but his focus entirely on her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, too exhausted to speak, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her and the baby, as the storm raged around them. On the far bank, Wilkes was being dragged from the water by two of Pike's men, but they no longer seemed interested in following orders. The fight had gone out of them, and one by one they dropped their rifles and walked away. Pike's body was not found. The river had taken him, and he was gone. The storm cleared by late afternoon, leaving the prairie washed clean and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Dr. Moore set up a makeshift clinic in the back of Samuel Rojas's wagon, and he worked through the injuries with Dorothea Briggs at his side. Ilan's forearm required 12 stitches, the wound deep but clean, and Moore sewed it closed with boiled thread and a steady hand that did not waver, despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Ayanna had a gash on her palm from clutching the ledger, and Moore bandaged it with strips of cloth soaked in whiskey. The baby, miraculously, was unharmed, except for a cough that would clear in a few days. While Moore worked, the crowd that had gathered on the near bank began to murmur and then to shout. Celia Harrow stood on a wagon bed and held up the ledger, her voice carrying over the noise. "This is the proof," she said. "Pike and Wilkes have been trafficking women for years, selling them to ranchers and miners like cattle. Cassandra Doyle was one of them, and Pike raped her, and when she tried to run, he tried to murder her and her child. We have the records, we have the witnesses, and we have the law on our side. This ends today." Ethel Brennan stepped forward, her face hard as stone. "My niece Sarah was one of the women Wilkes brought through. She's been missing for 2 years. I want justice for her. I want justice for all of them." Other voices joined hers, men and women who had lost loved ones, who had been silenced by fear, who were finally ready to speak. The anger was palpable, but Samuel Rojas raised his voice calm and steady, cutting through the noise. "We do this the right way," he said. "We take Wilkes to the territorial marshal, and we present the evidence, and we let the law decide. Pike is dead, but the system he built is still standing, and we need to tear it down piece by piece, legally and completely." The crowd quieted, and one by one they nodded. Quiet Quentin surrendered his badge to Samuel, his face pale but resolute. "I'll testify," he said. "I'll tell everything I know about Pike's operation, the bribes, the threats, the murders. I should have done it years ago. I was a coward, and people died because of it. But I'm done being silent." Samuel took the badge and looked at it for a long moment, then handed it back. "You'll testify, and you'll face consequences for what you did. But if you're willing to help us rebuild, there might be a place for you here. Under supervision. Under the law." Quentin nodded, and the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. As the sun set, Ilan and Ayanna sat beneath a wagon tarp, wrapped in blankets and holding the baby between them. The child was asleep, his breathing soft and even, and Ayanna's head rested on Ilan's shoulder. His arm was throbbing, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the woman beside him, and the way her fingers curled around his uninjured hand, and the way her breath warmed his neck. "You kept us alive," she said softly. "We kept each other," he replied. She lifted her head and looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart stutter. It was not just gratitude or relief. It was love, tentative and new, but real. "I meant what I said last night," she said. "I'm staying. I want to build something here, something that lasts. And I want you to stay too." He reached up and touched her face, his fingers brushing her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw. "I'm done running. I'm done being afraid. If you'll have me, I'll stay." She smiled, and he leaned down and kissed her deeper this time, his hand cradling the back of her head. She kissed him back with a fierceness that took his breath away, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "We'll do this together," she said. "Together," he agreed. The baby stirred between them, making a small sound, and they both laughed softly. Ilan wrapped his arm around Ayanna's shoulders, pulling her close, and they sat that way as the stars came out, watching the river flow and the town begin to heal. 1 month later, the circuit court convened in Buffalo Gap. The town had changed in the weeks since the confrontation at the bridge. The burned schoolhouse had been cleared away, and a new building was rising in its place, funded by donations from farmers and ranchers who wanted their children to have an education. The ferry crossing had been taken over by the railroad, which operated it as a public service with oversight from the territorial government. And the fees had been reduced to a fraction of what Wilkes had charged. Marcus Wilkes sat in a cell in the county jail awaiting trial, and his records had been seized as evidence. The courtroom was packed. Judge Harold Whitman, a stern man of 60 with a reputation for fairness that had been earned over 30 years on the bench, presided over the proceedings. Elan and Ayanna sat in the front row, the baby now 3 months old and thriving on Ayanna's lap. Beside them were Dr. Moore, Celia Harrow, Dorothea Briggs, Ethel Brennan, and Samuel Rojas, who wore the sheriff's badge with a gravity that spoke of the weight he carried. Quiet. Quentin testified first, his voice steady as he described Pike's operation in meticulous detail. The bribes paid to the telegraph operator, the threats made to witnesses, the women who had disappeared after trying to escape. He did not spare himself admitting his own complicity in Pike's crimes, and when he finished, the courtroom was silent. Dorothea Briggs testified next, her voice breaking, as she described the night she delivered Cassandra's baby and the words Cassandra had spoken. "He forced me," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. "The sheriff forced me, and now I'm going to have his child, and he'll kill me for it. She begged me to help her, and I was too afraid. I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." Celia Harrow presented the ledger, walking the judge through the entries with a schoolteacher's precision, the names, the payments, the destinations. Ethel Brennan testified about her niece Sarah, describing the last letter she had received and the months of fruitless searching that followed. 2 other women came forward with similar stories, their voices shaking but determined. Igor Petrov testified about his own experiences with Pike, describing how the sheriff had used legal maneuvers to seize his mining claim, and how he had witnessed Wilkes bringing women through the ferry at night, their faces hollow with fear. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Whitman listened to it all, his expression grave. And when the final witness had spoken, he delivered his verdict without hesitation. Marcus Wilkes was found guilty of the traffic in persons conspiracy to commit murder, maintaining a criminal venture, and running an unlawful traffic in persons. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of parole. The assets of Sheriff Jeremiah Pike, his ranch, his holdings, his shares in the ferry, were seized by the court and liquidated. The proceeds were divided among the victims and their families, with a portion set aside to establish a fund for the child Cassandra had left behind. The town elected Samuel Rojas as the new sheriff by a unanimous vote, and Quentin was allowed to remain as deputy under Samuel's direct supervision, with the understanding that any further misconduct would result in immediate dismissal and prosecution. Quentin accepted the conditions without complaint, and in the weeks that followed, he proved himself willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. But the biggest surprise came at the end of the trial, when a woman stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. She was 28 years old, dressed in a simple traveling suit with a high collar and long sleeves, her dark hair pinned up in a severe bun. She had the same sharp features as Jeremiah Pike, the same pale gray eyes. And when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady despite the tension that radiated from her. "My name is Delphine Pike," she said. "I'm the sheriff's estranged daughter and Reginald's older sister. I left this town 5 years ago because I could not stomach what my father and brother were doing. I tried to confront them, to make them see reason, and my father threatened to have me committed to an asylum for being hysterical. So I ran and I stayed away, and I've regretted it every day since." She produced a bundle of letters from her bag, tied with a faded ribbon. "These are letters Cassandra Doyle wrote to me. My father intercepted most of them, but a few got through. In them, Cassandra describes the abuse she suffered, the fear she felt, and her desperate hope that someone would help her escape. She also describes what my brother did to her and what my father did. She was clear-eyed and specific, and I believe every word. Delphine handed the letters to Judge Whitman, who examined them in silence. When he looked up, his expression was somber. "Miss Pike," he said, "do you have any requests regarding the disposition of this case?" "Yes," Delphine said. She turned to look at the baby in Ayana's arms, and her eyes softened. "I want justice for Cassandra. I want her child raised far from the Pike name by people who will love him and protect him. I'm asking the court to grant custody of the baby to people who have proven themselves worthy." Judge Whitman looked at Delphine, then at the baby, then at the assembled crowd. "Do you have a recommendation?" "Yes," Delphine said. She gestured to Dr. Moore and Celia Harrow. "These two have spent their lives caring for this town, often at great personal cost. I believe they would make excellent guardians." Moore and Celia exchanged glances, and then Moore nodded slowly. "We'll do it," he said, "with Elon and Ayana as co-guardians, if they're willing. The child should know where he comes from his mother's people, the Apache heritage that runs through his veins. He should grow up understanding both worlds." Elon looked at Ayana, saw the hope shining in her eyes, and felt his throat tighten. He had not expected this, had not dared to hope, that they might have a future that included the child they had risked everything to save. "We're willing," he said, and Ayana nodded beside him, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. Judge Whitman banged his gavel. "So ordered. Custody of the child is granted to Dr. Franklin Moore and Miss Celia Harrow, with Elon and Ayana serving as co-guardians. The Pike Ranch will be sold, and the proceeds will go to the victims of Jeremiah and Reginald Pike's crimes, and to establish a trust fund for the child's upbringing and education. Furthermore, I am ordering that the child be raised with knowledge of his mother's heritage and his Apache roots, so that he may grow up understanding the full truth of where he comes from." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Elon felt Ayana's hand tighten in his. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, and whispered, "We did it." "We did," he replied, and kissed her forehead, not caring who saw. 3 months later, winter settled over the prairie with a vengeance. Snow covered the ground in a thick white blanket, and the wind howled through the streets of Buffalo Gap, rattling shutters and piling drifts against the buildings. But inside the new schoolhouse, a fire burned in the stove, and children bent over their slates, learning to read and write under Celia Harrow's watchful eye. Elon and Ayana had built a small cabin on the edge of town, on land that Samuel Rojas had sold them for a fair price, with a loan from the bank that Dr. Moore had helped arrange. The cabin was modest, one room with a loft, a stone fireplace that Elon had built with his own hands, and a sturdy roof that did not leak, but it was theirs. They had spent the autumn working the land, planting a winter garden, cutting firewood, and preparing for the cold months ahead. On a clear, cold morning in December, Elon and Ayana stood on a ridge above the town, looking down at the Platte River. The water was frozen at the edges, and the willows stood bare against the sky, their branches etched in frost. Between them, wrapped in a wool blanket and a beaded cradleboard that Ayana had made, was the baby. Though he was not so much a baby anymore, but a sturdy infant with gray eyes and a tendency to laugh at the slightest provocation. They had named him after his mother, calling him Cassian in her honor, and he was thriving under the care of 4 people who loved him fiercely. "Winter will be hard." Elon said, his breath misting in the cold air. Ayana smiled and placed her hand on his chest right over his heart. "Then we stay close and do the work. We've faced worse." He covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath their joined hands. "We have. And we've survived." "More than survived," she said. She turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. "We've built something. a home, a family, a future. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks, and kissed her a long, deep kiss that spoke of promises made and kept, of love, earned through hardship, of a bond forged in fire and water, and the determination to do what was right. When they pulled apart, Cassian cooed and reached up with small hands, grabbing at the falling snow. Ayanna laughed, the sound bright and clear in the cold air, and Ilan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "What will you teach him?" he asked. "About his mother's people." "Everything," Ayanna said. "The language, the songs, the stories. How to make beadwork, how to read the land, how to honor the past while building the future. He'll know where he comes from, and he'll know that his mother was brave, and that she loved him enough to die trying to save him." "And I'll teach him to track," Ilan said. "To shoot straight, to survive in the wild, to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. He'll grow up strong. He'll grow up loved," Ayanna said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to her hair. Below them, the town was stirring. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved through the streets, going about their work. The ferry crossing was open to all, now operated fairly and without corruption. The schoolhouse stood proud on its hill, a symbol of the community's commitment to the future. And in the center of town, the new sheriff's office bore a sign that Samuel Rojas had carved himself, "Justice for All." The river ran on as it always had, carrying the memory of what had been and the promise of what might yet come. The shadows of corruption had lifted, burned away by the courage of a few people who refused to stay silent, who chose to fight even when the odds were against them. Elin felt the last of his walls crumble. He was no longer a man adrift, running from ghosts and grief. He was home with a woman he loved, and a child who would grow up knowing both worlds, the world of his mother's people, and the world his guardians were building piece by piece in the heart of the prairie. Ayanna shifted in his arms, and he looked down at her, saw the contentment in her face, and felt his heart swell with a gratitude so profound it made his chest ache. "I love you." He said the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything he had been too afraid to say for so long. She smiled, her eyes shining. "I love you too, and I'm not going anywhere." "Good," he said, "because neither am I." Cassian laughed, a bright, joyful sound that echoed across the ridge, and the three of them stood there as the sun climbed higher, turning the snow to gold. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. And for the first time in 5 years, Ilan felt at peace. The river ran on, the town healed, and life against all odds went on.